Welcome, curious minds and seekers of forgotten stories. Tonight, we will journey into the hidden laboratories of the Middle Ages, where men in long robes hunched over glass vessels, their eyes reflecting the shimmer of liquid silver. This is the tale of how medieval alchemists came to believe that Mercury, shifting, elusive, and dangerous, might be the very substance that could grant eternal life. As you listen, let your imagination settle among the candlelit chambers, the swirling vapors, and the secret hopes that once flickered in the hearts of those who dreamed of transcending mortality itself. Now let us begin. Why medieval alchemists believed Mercury was the key to immortality. Chapter 1. The liquid that defied the eye. In the centuries we call the Middle Ages, knowledge of the natural world was a tapestry woven from many threads. Fragments of ancient philosophy, glimpses of chemistry, fervent theology, and the peculiar visions of men who believed they could discover the secrets of existence itself. Among these secrets, none was more seductive or more perilous than the promise of immortality. To the alchemists who labored in quiet chambers across Europe, Mercury was not merely a substance. It was a paradox, a mystery, a shimmering clue. They called it quicksilver because it seemed to live. Unlike any other metal, it slipped through the fingers in bright globes. It reflected the faces of those who peered into it, only to break apart and scatter like liquid jewels. To medieval thinkers steeped in symbolism, this was no ordinary property. It was proof that Mercury belonged to the liminal spaces between solid and liquid, earth and sky, life and death. In parchment manuscripts copied by candlelight, scholars traced the lineage of Mercury's mystique. They wrote of how the Greeks had known it as hydrargyrum, the water's silver. The Arabs, whose translations preserved so much of antiquity, called it zibak. When these words passed into Latin, they gathered new layers of meaning, drawing connections to celestial influences and spiritual transformation. One of the earliest and most influential texts was attributed to the legendary Hermes Trismegistus, the supposed father of alchemy. His writings described Mercury as the spirit of all metals, the agent by which base substances could be perfected into gold. But beyond wealth, alchemists believed that perfection itself might be extended to the human body, that the elixir of life could be distilled if one could master Mercury's restless nature. It is difficult now, in our age of measure experiments and sterile laboratories, to imagine the fervor with which medieval alchemists pursued this goal. They were men of conviction, often learned, sometimes desperate. Many had seen too much death. Plague, war, famine. They yearned for a remedy to the frailty of flesh. Within the low stone rooms where they worked, Mercury was both a tool and a symbol. Glass flasks clinked as powders were weighed. Coals hissed beneath crucibles. When Mercury was heated, it vanished into vapor, only to reappear as droplets along the cooled glass. This seeming resurrection was taken as a sign that nature itself hinted at the cycle of life renewed. One chronicler described watching an alchemist perform this demonstration. He set the glass upon the flame, and as the mercury fled upward in smoke, he declared, "Behold the soul ascending." Then he cooled the vessel, and the silver globes formed anew. And he said, "And so the spirit returns to the body, undiminished." It was this capacity to transmute, vanishing, returning, evading capture, that convinced many the secret of immortality lay within. If Mercury could defy transformation and remain whole, might it not also heal and preserve the human body? The search was not only practical, it was mystical. Alchemy was never solely about substances. It was a mirror for the alchemist's own transformation. As the material was refined, so too was the spirit. As the mercury passed through stages, blackening, whitening, reddening, so the practitioner believed he ascended toward enlightenment. In monastic scriptoria, scribes preserved recipes that promised great wonders, to purify metals, to cleanse illness, to extend life. Some recipes were simple, the mixing of herbs with distilled water. Others were elaborate, requiring weeks of preparation and rare ingredients from distant lands: cinnabar from Spain, salmoniac from Egypt, camphor from the East. Always, Mercury stood at the center. Its brilliance was a lure, and its poison a test of the seeker's discipline. Those who worked with it for long years often paid the price: trembling hands, failing memory, weakness that no tincture could cure. Yet even these afflictions did not erase the conviction that the secret was close, almost within reach. It is easy to see these alchemists as deluded, but they were also inheritors of an older dream, that mortality could be overcome not only through faith but through understanding. They looked at the bright drops of Mercury and saw not a hazard but a promise, that the boundary between life and death was not unbreakable. In the centuries to come, their experiments would gradually evolve into the sciences we know today. Chemistry would replace alchemy. Pharmacology would replace the search for elixirs. But the longing itself, the desire to grasp what lies beyond the veil, remains as strong as ever. As we leave this first chapter, let us linger for a moment in that dim chamber. A single lamp casting light on parchment and glass, the alchemist's eyes reflecting the glow of the quicksilver. In his heart, he holds a hope older than any manuscript. The hope that the secret to eternal life is hidden somewhere in the shimmering depths of that restless metal. Chapter 2: Cinnabar and the Blood of the Earth. In the world of medieval alchemy, no substance held as much symbolic gravity as cinnabar, the deep red mineral that offered the most potent and the most perilous source of mercury. To the untrained eye, cinnabar looked like blood turned to stone. Found in veins along mountainsides or gathered from the crumbling walls of deep earth caverns, it shimmered with a red so vivid it startled the senses. Alchemists believed it to be the flesh of the earth, saturated with power, pulsing with the same mystery that surrounded human life. And like all things of beauty in alchemy, it concealed danger. When heated in a closed vessel, cinnabar released mercury vapor, transforming stone into liquid metal in a process that many alchemists likened to the separation of soul from body. This transformation was not simply chemical in their minds. It was spiritual. The red of cinnabar was the color of life, of blood, of transformation. The silver that emerged was seen as its essence, purified, free from earthly form. Such ideas were not invented by medieval thinkers alone. They had inherited them from ancient sources: Arabic manuscripts, Greek treatises, and whispered fragments of Egyptian lore. In particular, writings attributed to the Persian scholar Jabir ibn Ayan, known in Latin as Geber, spoke of mercury and sulfur as the two primal essences from which all metals, and perhaps all matter, derived. According to this theory, every metal contained a balance of mercury, its spirit or fluidity, and sulfur, its fixity or soul. To change one metal into another, or one state of being into another, an alchemist had only to discover the precise purification and recombination of these twin principles. Cinnabar, then, was not just a substance. It was a microcosm of transformation. In monasteries and remote towers, alchemists labored to unlock its secrets. They built furnaces from brick and clay, fed them with charcoal, and carefully prepared retorts, glass or ceramic vessels designed to trap the silver vapor as it escaped. The process was delicate, often dangerous. A misjudged flame could crack the vessel. A poorly sealed lid could release toxic fumes. But those who succeeded were rewarded with drops of bright mercury pooling in the receiving dish, proof that the mineral had yielded its essence. One alchemist, writing under the name Morius, describes cinnabar as the dragon of the earth, who must be slain by fire and reborn in silver scales. This mythic language was no mere poetry. For medieval practitioners, every substance carried allegorical weight. The dragon, the phoenix, the lion, these are not fantasy creatures but coded symbols of processes within the lab and the soul. Cinnabar's red was often likened to the rubedo, or reddening, the final stage of alchemical transformation. In this stage, matter, and the alchemist himself, was said to reach full enlightenment, the completion of the journey. To see red was to see perfection. And so, Cinnabar was revered not just as a means to Mercury, but as a foretaste of the goal itself. Yet the cost of such reverence was high. Prolonged exposure to cinnabar dust or mercury vapors released from it brought symptoms that were well known but poorly understood: trembling, insomnia, melancholy, decay of memory. Some alchemists saw these afflictions as a kind of spiritual trial, a purification by poison, a test of worthiness. Others, more cautious, sought to mitigate the effects with herbal antidotes, cold compresses, and prayer. Manuscripts from German and Italian alchemists often included marginal notes warning novices. Do not sleep in the room of distillation, or let no child touch this powder, for it carries a hidden fire. But for every warning, there were 10 who pressed on. The idea of immortality was not always understood literally. To live forever in the flesh was one hope. But to transcend decay, to leave behind disease and corruption, to master the forces of change, that too was a form of eternal life. Alchemists who believed in Mercury's role as the universal solvent imagined it as the key to unlocking this state. They believed that Mercury, born of cinnabar, could carry within it the quinta essentia, the fifth essence, the purest form of matter that underlay all things. If captured and refined, it could cure all illness. It could fix the body as surely as it fixed metals. One tale, passed down through generations of manuscripts, told of a wandering alchemist who cured a dying nobleman with a tincture derived from mercury and red wine. The nobleman lived, but the alchemist vanished, leaving behind only a scrap of parchment bearing the word immortalis. Was it a parable? A hoax? A metaphor? In the world of alchemy, all three could be true at once. The appeal of cinnabar also stretched beyond the lab. Artists and scribes prized it as the source of vermilion, the brilliant red pigment used in illuminated manuscripts, frescoes, and icons. In this way, the same substance that symbolized spiritual transformation in the alchemist's furnace became the color of saints' robes, royal seals, and sacred margins. Thus, Mercury's influence, born from cinnabar, seeped into art, medicine, religion, and dreams. As the Middle Ages wore on, the supply of cinnabar grew scarcer, and the methods of its processing became more guarded. Some alchemists encrypted their recipes, hiding key steps behind metaphors or mythic imagery. Others formed secret guilds, passing down their knowledge only through oral tradition. But in each generation, there were those who returned to the red rock, broke it open with a hammer and hope, and fed it to the flame. They were chasing more than metal. They were chasing the moment when the dull breaks into brilliance, when stone weeps silver, when the hidden becomes seen. In the next chapter, we will explore how Mercury's duality, its beauty and its danger, came to reflect the very nature of the alchemist's quest, not only for eternal life, but for balance, for understanding, and for the mastery of inner and outer worlds. But for now, rest in the image of a single flake of cinnabar crumbling under fire, its red giving way to the shine of something more elusive, more luminous, and perhaps eternal. Chapter 3. The Philosopher's Dream. To understand why Mercury became such an obsession, you must look not only into the furnaces and manuscripts of alchemists, but also into the chambers where philosophers gather by lamplight to debate the order of the cosmos. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of ideas. Some threads came from Aristotle, who taught that everything was formed of 4 elements: earth, water, air, and fire. Others came from Plato, who spoke of ideal forms and the imperfection of matter. Still others drifted in from Arabic scholars like Al-Razi, whose writings described chemical operations in language half scientific, half symbolic. In this intellectual ferment, the notion arose that Mercury was not simply a metal, nor merely a substance that could cure disease or transmute base matter. To some, it was the living principle itself, the hidden link between the visible and invisible worlds. Among the most influential thinkers was an enigmatic figure known in Latin as Albertus Magnus, or Albert the Great. A scholar and Dominican friar, Albert studied Aristotle and observed the properties of minerals with patient curiosity. Though he warned that the quest to perfect nature could lead men astray, he also allowed that Mercury possessed unique virtues, powers that hinted at a deeper harmony within creation. His pupil, Thomas Aquinas, approached alchemy with caution. Yet even he conceded that substances might be purified to reveal their noble qualities, reflecting the divine order God had embedded in the universe. These ideas traveled from monastery libraries to the hands of itinerant teachers who carried books in leather satchels and read aloud to gatherings of clerics, merchants, and noble patrons. Mercury, described in their words, became more than a liquid. It was an emblem of possibility, a possibility that drew minds across Europe into shared fascination and, sometimes, shared folly. In the city of Paris, with the narrow lanes around Notre Dame thronged with traders and pilgrims, one could find small shops selling packets of powdered cinnabar and vials of distilled mercury. Apothecaries displayed them behind glass, cautioning buyers that improper use could be fatal. Yet these warnings did little to deter those determined to discover the secret of incorruptibility. Among them were not only alchemists, but physicians, who hoped that mercury, properly prepared, might be an ingredient in the legendary panacea, a universal medicine that could heal all maladies and perhaps even slow the decay of age itself. At the heart of this faith lay an ancient belief that corruption was not inevitable, that nature, in her purest state, was perfect and self-renewing. If man could find the hidden purity within substances, if he could capture the volatile spark of life, he might remake his own body in the same image. So it was that Mercury, with its restless transformations, became the focus of the philosopher's dream. One manuscript from the 14th century, copied in an Italian monastery and later smuggled into Germany, contained a passage often quoted in hushed voices. Within this quicksilver lies a spirit most subtle, which dissolves all impurity and unites all division. In this union is the seed of perpetuity. To those who longed for certainty in an uncertain world, such words were irresistible. Imagine the times in which they were written: villages struck by plague without warning, harvests lost to storms, kingdoms thrown into ruin by war. In the face of so much impermanence, the promise of something unchanging, something eternal, was more than intellectual curiosity. It was a salve for fear. And so, in the late evenings, alchemists would close the shutters against the cold and light their lamps. Mercury gleamed in shallow bowls. Parchments lay open, their margins crowded with notes in cramped script. Mixtures to try, temperatures to hold, prayers to whisper over the vessels. They called this labor the magnum opus, the great work. In the earliest stages, Mercury symbolized the prima materia, the raw beginning from which all transformation would arise. The alchemist's task was to bring it through blackness, the nigredo, then whitening, albedo, and finally the reddening, rubedo, that signified perfection. Each phase had its own allegories: the raven, the swan, the phoenix reborn in flame. And in each, Mercury played a central role, because it alone could move between states. It alone was the substance that seemed alive. Some chroniclers recorded tales of men who claimed to have reached the final stage, creating not only gold but an elixir that preserved youth. Their names became legends whispered in marketplaces and along the roads traveled by merchants: Ramon Huey, Nicholas Flamel, Basil Valentine. Most historians now agree these stories were embroidered, if not entirely invented, but they reveal the hunger that Mercury inspired. Even among skeptics, the philosopher's dream lingered. The idea that knowledge, pursued with devotion, could conquer decay, outlast kingdoms, and redeem the frailty of flesh was too potent to dismiss. Of course, not every alchemist was a scholar or a monk. Some were artisans, metalworkers, or healers whose practices blurred the line between practical craft and speculative art. In remote villages, a man with a small furnace and a few jars could earn a reputation as a wonder worker, able to extract virtue from earth itself. For these humble practitioners, Mercury was both a promise and a test. Many labored in poverty, scraping together coins to buy more cinnabar, bartering for fuel to keep their furnaces alight. Yet they persevered, convinced that if only they refined their method, they would find the one preparation that eluded all others. And perhaps, in the flickering lamplight, as mercury rose and fell in their flasks, they felt a kinship with the philosophers in distant cities, different in learning, but joined in longing. At times, this longing spilled beyond the confines of alchemical texts. In poetry and song, minstrels wove tales of men who drank from silver vials and never aged again. In the illuminated margins of psalters, tiny figures knelt beside vats, as if beseeching the contents for a blessing. These images remind us that alchemy was not a secret pursuit locked away from ordinary life. It was part of the cultural imagination, an echo of the universal desire to overcome limits. By the dawn of the Renaissance, the intellectual climate was shifting. New philosophies arose, emphasizing observation over tradition. Yet Mercury retained its place as the most fascinating, dangerous, and hopeful of substances. It is easy to smile at the old stories, to see them as superstition. But when you look closely, you find something more enduring, the conviction that the world holds secrets, and that with patience and wonder, a mortal might uncover them. In the next chapter, we will step into the hidden laboratories where Mercury was not only studied but venerated, where alchemists risked body and soul in search of the perfect medicine, the perfect transformation, the perfect redemption. For now, let us leave our philosopher, hunched over his manuscript, the candlelight flickering in the bright surface of Mercury, an image of longing and of the endless question, what if it were true? Chapter 4. The Labors Behind Locked Doors. Not all who sought the secrets of Mercury did so in public. While some alchemists lectured or wrote, others worked in silence, behind locked doors, drawn not to fame, but to the possibility of finding what no one else had, the formula that could lift mankind beyond decay. Their laboratories were often humble, converted storerooms, cellars beneath monasteries, sheds hidden at the edge of town. They were rarely grand. More often, they were cloaked in the smell of ash, the creak of warped wood, and the flickering light of a single oil lamp. In such rooms, time seemed to behave differently. Days blurred as the alchemist tended coals, waited for condensation, observed the silvery dance of mercury as it rose and fell through a maze of tubes and flasks. Every reaction, however small, was cause for note. A change in color, a hiss of escaping vapor, a pattern of crystals forming along the neck of glass. The great effort was always purification. To take something impure, raw cinnabar, dull lead, corrupted copper, and draw out its hidden essence. For in that essence, they believed, lay the clue not only to turning metal into gold, but to transforming the body and spirit. The idea was simple, but the process never was. Recipes varied from region to region, but most began with the same steps. Crush the cinnabar, mix it with salt, sometimes with sulfur or vinegars distilled from wine. Place it in a sealed retort, then heat slowly, never too fast, lest the vessel crack or the contents erupt. Inside, the mercury would escape its mineral prison, vaporize, then collect again, cooling along the glass into beads of quicksilver. These would then be redistilled, purified further, again and again, until only the most noble portion remained. This endless repetition, the same fire, the same liquid, the same careful collection, was not madness. It was devotion, a belief that repetition would lead to revelation. That somewhere in the consistency of practice, a door would open. Some alchemists worked alone. Others had assistants, apprentices who learned not from books, but from long hours of watching and waiting. In return, they might be trusted with secrets. or they might be sent away the moment they asked too many questions. For secrecy was part of the labor. Recipes were guarded jealously, passed on in coded symbols or riddles. Manuscripts might speak of the Red King and the White Queen, of the Green Lion devouring the sun, all allegories for ingredients and stages in the alchemical process. Only the initiated knew their true meaning. Why such secrecy? Partly it was fear of ridicule, of theft, of persecution. But also it was tradition. Alchemy had always carried a sense of the sacred. One did not cast pearls before swine. One did not hand over the philosopher's stone to those who had not walked the path. Mercury was often described not only as dangerous, but as temperamental. Too much heat, and it fled. Too little, and it sulked in the bottom of the flask. Some claimed it reacted to mood, to the alchemist's spirit. If you approached it in anger, it would rebel. If you doubted its power, it would conceal itself. It is easy now to dismiss such thoughts as superstition. But for those working by candlelight, alone with vapors and symbols, such beliefs made sense. Mercury behaved unlike any other substance. It was not unreasonable to imagine it had a will of its own, and sometimes the experiments produced results that were hard to explain. Metals that changed color, crystals that grew in star shapes, liquids that flew arrest under moonlight. Even if the alchemist failed to find immortality, he might stumble upon something no one else had ever seen. There are records, fragmentary but suggestive, of alchemists who believed they had created living mercury, not simply the metal, but a form that responded, shifted, pulsed with vitality. Perhaps they mistook chemical reactions for life. Perhaps not. One such tale comes from a manuscript preserved in Prague. It describes an alchemist named Theophilus who claimed to have made a drop of mercury that divided into three, then rejoined into one without any external force. He wrote, "I beheld it, and it beheld me. It moved as if it remembered." No one ever confirmed Theophilus's discovery. He vanished soon after, but the story survived, copied into other manuscripts, embroidered with whispers. Such tales fed the imagination of those who came after. They fueled the belief that mercury, purified enough, might cross the boundary between the material and the immaterial, that it might not only extend life but contain a soul. We do not know how many of these men died at their furnaces, breathing poisoned air, touching metal with bare hands, suffering tremors and madness from long exposure. But their notes remain, ink faded but not erased, as do the curious instruments they left behind: coiled tubes, globes sealed with wax, spatulas etched with symbols. In the grand cathedrals of Europe, few mention the alchemists in their stone reliefs or stained glass. Yet not far away, beneath cellars or within monasteries, the quiet effort continued. The quest for eternal life through mercury was never a movement. It was always a murmur, a thread running through centuries, drawing the patient, the obsessed, the broken-hearted, and the brilliant. Some may have seen in mercury a reflection of their own hope, unstable, elusive, yet luminous. Others saw in it a kind of test. Could they master their own desire, their own fear, their own mortality? By the late Middle Ages, as science began to evolve and separate itself from philosophy, many began to dismiss the old dream. But not all. In hidden corners, behind unmarked doors, the furnaces still glowed. In the next chapter, we will follow the trail of mercury into the royal courts and imperial laboratories, where kings and queens, too, became patrons of the search for immortality, willing to invest gold in pursuit of silver that never slept. But for now, imagine that silent room. The alchemist leans forward, eyes glinting. In his flask, a bead of mercury rolls. Not just a metal, but perhaps, just perhaps, a mirror into the infinite. Chapter 5, Courts of Silver and Gold. Though alchemy often dwelled in shadows, monasteries, lonely towers, village corners, there were places where its glow reached all the way to marble halls and velvet curtain courts. The fascination with mercury and the tantalizing promise it held did not stay confined to monks and mystics. It climbed palace stairs, By the 14th century, European rulers were not merely warriors and lawmakers. Many styled themselves as patrons of learning, guardians of hidden wisdom. They maintained libraries and collected rare manuscripts. And as rumors of miraculous transformations and eternal life traveled through the continent, more than one noble became enchanted by the whispers of Mercury's secrets. In Prague, the court of Emperor Rudolf II would become legendary for its obsession with alchemy. Though Rudolf would reign in the late 16th century, he drew upon a legacy that had already been growing for centuries, one that cast Mercury as both a material of magic and a mirror of kingship. Earlier monarchs, too, had dabbled in the arcane. King Charles V of France, who ruled in the 14th century, was said to keep an alchemist in his employ, housed within a private laboratory attached to the Louvre. The alchemist's task was not only to find gold, but to pursue the elusive aqua mercurialis, a tincture of mercury thought to preserve youth and mental clarity. In England, Edward III reportedly entertained alchemists who claimed to be on the brink of producing the Philosopher's Stone. It was not uncommon for nobles to purchase mercury distillates from traveling apothecaries or whispered physicians, dripping silver and veiled with promises. Why would those already surrounded by gold turn to mercury? Because mercury offered more than wealth. It offered control over health, over age, over fate itself. To kings, constantly threatened by illness, assassination, or the fragility of heirs, the idea of a silvery elixir capable of preserving the body was more precious than any coin. Thus, royal courts began to fund alchemical laboratories. These were no longer the crude rooms of wandering philosophers. These were lavish workspaces outfitted with imported glassware, rare chemicals, and stone furnaces built with royal masons. Servants tended fires day and night. Record keepers tracked every experiment. And most importantly, court alchemists were watched closely, because their promise was bold, and failure was not always forgiven. One such alchemist, a man named Jean de Rouen, served a minor duke in Burgundy. He claimed to have distilled a preparation of mercury that could revive the weary limbs of age and make the breath of the old sweet again. His elixir was administered to a nobleman's brother, who promptly fell into a feverish sleep and died 3 days later. Jean de Rouen disappeared into the night. Another tale, less tragic, comes from the court of Sigismund of Hungary, where an alchemist named Peter of Florence demonstrated a mercury-based mixture that turned silver coins temporarily golden in the light of the hearth. For a time, Sigismund believed the man had achieved transmutation. When the color faded days later, the emperor had him imprisoned, not out of cruelty, but out of obsession. He believed the man had started the process and wanted to keep him until he finished it. Such stories illuminate the strange role alchemists played at court. Half healer, half wizard, often walking a dangerous line between celebrated genius and suspected fraud. And yet, some gained true prestige. Paracelsus, a physician and alchemist who rose to prominence in the 16th century, openly used mercury-based compounds to treat disease. He insisted that sickness was not a punishment from the divine, but a natural imbalance, and that mercury, properly administered, could restore equilibrium. Though Paracelsus came later, his approach echoed earlier court alchemists who believed mercury had medicinal potential. At times, this was tragically misapplied. Syphilis, which swept across Europe in the late Middle Ages, was often treated with mercury rubs and vapors. Patients would be wrapped in cloaks, placed in steam baths infused with mercury fumes, and made to sweat. In many cases, the cure was worse than the disease. Teeth fell out, gums bled, minds unraveled. But in desperation, kings and commoners alike returned again and again to mercury's lure. Because what was the alternative? Suffering, death, and the silent darkness that followed. There are also gentler applications. Some alchemists claimed mercury could be mixed with powdered pearls or crushed coral to create rejuvenating creams. A few noble women wrote in diaries that their hands stayed fair and smooth after rubbing in a small silver lotion prepared by a Moorish physician. These records are rare, but they show that the idea of Mercury as life-giver extended beyond the laboratory. In art, too, Mercury's legend began to shine. Paintings commissioned by royalty sometimes depicted mythical scenes of alchemical transformation, kings being crowned not by angels, but by personifications of Mercury in gold. Manuscripts for royal heirs were illuminated with red and silver ink, symbolic of cinnabar and Mercury, transformation and spirit. The line between science and ritual, between study and spectacle, grew thin. Alchemical demonstrations were staged like theater. Royal audiences watched as flames turned powders to smoke, or as beads of mercury merged into one. Every flicker of light was received as a sign. And so, mercury became embedded not just in royal curiosity, but in the ritual of power. It was a symbol of what kings and queens most desired: control over life's uncertain elements. Yet the paradox was always present. The very substance they pursued for immortality was poisonous. The glowing elixirs they consumed corroded the body. The silvery vapor they breathed eroded the mind. Still, they continued, not because they were foolish, but because they were human. They had seen loved ones die. They had watched themselves age in mirrors. They had heard the clock ticking, louder each year. To reach for Mercury was to hope. To believe that somewhere, buried in the folds of transformation, was an answer not only to rot and pain and decay, but to the question that haunts all rulers and all men alike. Must everything pass away? In the next chapter, we will turn from kings and courts to another kind of seeker, the wandering alchemist, carrying mercury across borders, hidden in flasks, protected by symbols. Neither noble nor monk, he was the bridge between worlds, and sometimes between centuries. For now, let us leave the court's grand chamber, where a nobleman watches silver drops swirl in a goblet, unsure if he is drinking a miracle or his own end. Chapter 6. The Itinerant Adept. Long before alchemy settled into royal courts or monastic scriptoria, it traveled the roads. In many ways, it was never truly at home in any fixed place. It belonged to the minds that carried it across borders. Sometimes as hidden knowledge, sometimes as rumor, sometimes as fragile flasks clinking in saddlebags. Among the most intriguing figures in the history of Mercury were the wandering alchemists, those who did not swear allegiance to a single patron but moved from city to city, offering their services to whoever could pay or whoever seemed worthy. To the authorities, they were suspicious. To common folk, they were both feared and revered. To each other, they were kin, bound by the knowledge that their work was neither fully accepted nor fully rejected by the societies they passed through. One such man, known only as Arnaud the Pale, left traces in the archives of Aragon and Provence. He appears in a handful of records: a receipt for a cinnabar shipment, a complaint from a nobleman who claimed Arnaud had promised to transmute lead into gold and preserve life, and a short confession, scribbled in the margin of a ledger, that he had once cured a child's convulsions with a mercury tincture. Beyond these fragments, little is certain, but when you read the lines he left, you glimpsed the outline of a life lived on the thresholds. Traveling alchemists relied on a network of apothecaries, midwives, and itinerant scholars to procure supplies. They bartered herbs for minerals, traded knowledge for safe lodging, and learned to recognize which towns were receptive to their art. Some villages welcomed them as healers, believing mercury to be a sacred substance, liquid moonlight, a medicine left behind by angels. Others accused them of heresy, or worse, of trafficking in poisons. In times of plague, when fear blurred the line between healer and sorcerer, many itinerant alchemists hid their vials under layers of cloth and disguised their trade as simple pharmacy. Still, their reputations traveled faster than they did. A single demonstration, a drop of mercury dancing across a plate, or a paste of cinnabar turning pale silver under heat, was enough to kindle rumors. In marketplaces, men whispered that the stranger with the stained hands could brew life itself in a cup. And so the alchemist's journey became a delicate balance, to reveal enough to inspire faith, but never so much as to provoke fear. Mercury was both a tool and a talisman. Arnaud the Pale, in a letter discovered centuries later, wrote, "Wherever I go, they ask me why I carry quicksilver. I answer that it is the soul of transformation." But most do not understand. They look at the shining drop and see poison or trickery. They cannot imagine that within it dwells the reflection of all things. His words echo the paradox that haunted every practitioner. To the uninitiated, mercury was a threat, its fumes invisible, its touch corrosive. Yet to the adept, it was a teacher, revealing in its restless motion the hidden laws of nature. Traveling alchemists often adopted cryptic symbols to protect their recipes. A simple drawing of a serpent eating its tail, a symbol called the Ouroboros, could mark a manuscript as belonging to the same fraternity of seekers. Mercury was sometimes called the dragon's milk or the lunar water, names that obscured its identity from prying eyes. In this way, knowledge was preserved not in great libraries, but in the memories and secret writings of men who never stayed in one place long enough to be captured or silenced. It was a fragile system, but it endured. From time to time, traveling alchemists gathered in discreet circles, meetings arranged by coded letters or arranged at pilgrim hostels, far from the reach of inquisitors. There, they traded insights about furnaces and vessels, shared news of patrons, and debated the most tantalizing question of all. Could mercury, if purified beyond all earthly corruption, become the seed of immortality? Some claimed yes. A few insisted they had seen it. Mercury, so refined it was no longer metal, but something higher, something luminous. They called it the Mercurius Philosophorum, the mercury of the philosophers. Not ordinary quicksilver, but the perfected spirit hidden within. Of course, no proof survived, but the allure was powerful enough to draw men across mountains and borders in search of the next hint, the next demonstration, the next crumb of revelation. Even in failure, the work had meaning. For the itinerant adept, the journey itself became a kind of alchemical process. The hardships, the suspicion, the loneliness, all of it was part of purification. Just as mercury was cleansed by repeated distillation, so too was the alchemist's resolve tempered by exile and doubt. When you imagine them, these solitary figures on the roads of medieval Europe, you can almost see the contradictions in every step. They were both beggars and philosophers, charlatans and visionaries. In the eyes of some, they were criminals. In their own eyes, they were pilgrims of knowledge, carrying the secret fire through lands too fearful to embrace it. And in the small rooms where they paused to work, a familiar scene unfolded. The furnace lit, the cinnabar ground, the crucible warmed. The same silver beads of mercury pooled in the same cracked dishes. Each drop a glimmer of possibility, each experiment a wager against time. By the close of the Middle Ages, as universities began to codify natural philosophy into what would become modern science, the itinerant alchemist grew rarer. The work passed gradually into fixed institutions, royal laboratories, city guilds, and the learned societies of the Renaissance. But even then, the memory of the wandering mercury seekers persisted in folklore. They became figures of caution and of wonder, men who dared to carry poison in their packs because they believed it was also a cure. In the next chapter, we will leave the roads behind and step into the grand libraries where alchemical texts, long hidden, began to be collected and compared, laying the groundwork for new visions of matter and life. For now, picture the solitary traveler disappearing down a winding path, the last rays of the sun glinting on the flask at his side, a small, shifting mirror that promised more than any gold coin could buy. Chapter 7. Libraries of Secret Fire. As the centuries turned and the roads grew quieter for itinerant alchemists, a new force rose to take their place, the library. It may seem strange that a craft so rooted in fire, smoke, and metal would find its next home among ink and parchment. Yet it was in the quiet cloisters of abbeys, in the upper chambers of universities, and behind locked doors of noble estates that Mercury's story would be carried forward, preserved not in crucibles, but in manuscripts bound in leather and dust. The shift was gradual, born of necessity. The dangers of wandering alchemy, exposure to poison, suspicion of sorcery, accusation of fraud, had taken their toll. Knowledge that once moved from mouth to ear began instead to settle into written form, wrapped in layers of symbolism, allegory, and coded Latin. The libraries that housed such manuscripts were not always vast. In fact, some of the most important texts on Mercury and immortality were stored in single rooms. Cells lined with shelves, tended by scholars who rarely left their desks. One such place was the Benedictine monastery at Monte Cassino, perched in the hills of southern Italy. There, among hymns and herbals, lay a narrow cabinet labeled Scientia Secreta, the secret science. Within it, bound in goatskin, was a 12th century copy of an earlier Arabic treatise, the Book of the Hidden Pearl. This manuscript, translated from a lost original attributed to Jabir ibn Hayyan, described Mercury not only as a metal, but as a spiritus mundi, a spirit of the world. It outlined processes for refining mercury through sublimation and distillation, using symbols instead of names: a dove for water, a lion for sulfur, and a dragon for mercury itself. To the untrained eye, it was a book of beasts and riddles. To those initiated, it was a guide to immortality. And it was not alone. Across Europe, in cities like Toledo, Salerno, Paris, and Oxford, scholars were copying and commenting on alchemical texts. Some came from ancient Greek authors, others from Arabic polymaths, and still more from anonymous sources who had passed along scraps of formula, philosophy, and belief. Among them, mercury remained central. It was described as the seed of metals, the only substance that contained both masculine and feminine qualities, both spirit and body. One text from the 13th century stated, "In mercury is the key of both decay and life, for it holds the moisture of the moon and the fixity of the earth. It dances, and in its dance is transformation." What made mercury so compelling to these scholars was not just its behavior in the lab, but what it seemed to represent in the grand structure of the cosmos. According to the great chain of being, a medieval concept of cosmic order, everything in existence had its place, from stones at the bottom to angels at the top. Man sat in the middle, balanced between matter and spirit. To move upward on this chain, to become more noble, more eternal, was the goal not only of theology, but of alchemy. Mercury, then, was the model. It was the one earthly substance that refused to stay fixed. It could evaporate, flow, condense. It never rusted. It never rotted. It shimmered like a dream and killed like a poison. What if the soul could become like that? In the University of Bologna, a professor named Bernardus of Treviso assembled a personal library of nearly 70 alchemical works, including multiple volumes dedicated solely to the purification of mercury. His notes, preserved in the margins, suggest a deeply personal investment in the idea of extending life. In one passage, written in shaky hand, he reflects, "Each year the joints ache more. Each night is colder than the last. But the silver within the flask remains ever young. Therein lies the hope of all flesh." Such reflections were not uncommon. As the body declined, the mind turned to the possibility that nature held a secret code, one that, if deciphered, could reverse time's cruelty. It was no longer enough to observe mercury in the furnace. The task now was to understand it through study, through language, through the weaving of chemical practice and cosmic philosophy. This led to the rise of what some called the philosophical mercury, not a substance you could buy from an apothecary, but a metaphysical idea. In many texts, it was not clear whether the writer was speaking of an actual element or of a state of being, a purified soul, an enlightened mind, a body in perfect balance. This ambiguity was deliberate. By cloaking their meanings in riddles, scholars protected their work from censors and from those who sought shortcuts to power. In this environment, alchemical allegory flourished. A popular motif was the marriage of Mercury and sulfur, described in poetry as a king and queen, a union of opposites, a symbolic fusion that would produce the philosopher's stone. In the artwork that accompanied these texts, Mercury was shown as a pale youth holding a mirror, often standing beside a pool or well. His gaze was never fixed on the viewer, but always turned inward or upward, searching for truth in reflection. As libraries grew, so did doubt. The more scholars studied, the more they disagreed. Some argued that Mercury was the beginning of transformation. Others said it was the final step. A few insisted that immortality lay not in Mercury itself, but in what Mercury revealed about the structure of matter. Still, the dream endured, because deep down, those who studied Mercury, whether in dusty libraries or darkened labs, shared something timeless: the longing for continuity, for renewal, for escape from impermanence. They saw the world aging, failing, falling. They saw themselves following, and they asked again and again, could anything last? In the next chapter, we will explore how these questions began to meet resistance. From skeptics, reformers, and early scientists who saw alchemy as fantasy. But before we leave these quiet libraries, let us honor them. For in their silence, surrounded by silver ink and flaking vellum, humanity paused and listened. And Mercury, with its restless shimmer, answered, not with certainty, but with the invitation to look deeper. Chapter 8: The Seeds of Doubt. For centuries, Mercury had captivated alchemists and their patrons alike. It gleamed in flasks, pooled in the palm like liquid jewels, and shimmered in the imagination as the promise of transformation. But by the dawn of the 15th century, a slow shift began to stir in Europe's learned circles, a questioning that would, in time, give birth to the first true critiques of alchemy's golden legends. The seeds of this doubt were planted in many places at once. In the universities of Paris and Oxford, scholars were refining Aristotelian natural philosophy into a more rigorous discipline. They insisted that all claims, no matter how ancient or respected, must be tested by reason and observation. In Italy, the stirrings of humanism turned scholars' eyes back to Greek and Roman texts, some of which were openly skeptical of magical arts. And in cities newly enriched by trade, Florence, Bruges, Lubeck, merchants began to value practical knowledge over mystical speculation. Mercury sat at the center of this gathering storm. Its undeniable toxicity had become impossible to ignore. Physicians observed that miners who worked in cinnabar pits developed tremors and hallucinations. Artisans who gilded mirrors with mercury lost teeth and suffered convulsions. Apothecaries handling mercurial ointments reported headaches, nausea, and darkened vision. More unsettling still, the grand promises of immortality remained unfulfilled. No philosopher's stone had emerged from the furnaces. No ruler who drank mercury tinctures had been spared the toll of age. As decades passed, the stories grew harder to defend. Yet belief did not vanish overnight. It retreated, adapted, and often redoubled in the face of criticism. Some alchemists responded by insisting that the failures were the result of imperfect practice, that their predecessors simply lacked the patience or piety to purify mercury to its true potential. Others argued that the art was not meant for everyone, and that only initiates, properly prepared in body and spirit, could ever hope to succeed. Among the skeptics, however, another voice emerged, that of the early experimenter. These were men who accepted that mercury was fascinating, perhaps even essential to understanding the natural world, but who rejected its mythical aura. They believed that knowledge must be built step by step, through repetition and documentation. One such figure was Nicholas of Poland, a Dominican friar who wrote a small but influential treatise known as the Experimenta. In it, Nicholas detailed his attempts to refine mercury, to observe its behavior under different heats, and to record its effects on other metals. He did so without the elaborate allegories that had filled earlier texts. For Nicholas, the question was not whether mercury could grant immortality, but what it actually did when handled with care. His notes were clear and modest. He described how mercury could amalgamate gold into a soft paste, how it could dissolve tin and silver, and how it resisted corrosion. He documented the symptoms of mercury poisoning with unflinching honesty, remarking that no man can hold it daily without trembling of the limbs. Though Nicholas never fully abandoned the hope that mercury had higher properties, he laid the groundwork for a more empirical approach, one that would, in centuries to come, give rise to modern chemistry. Yet even as these sober voices multiplied, the allure of mercury proved stubborn. Many continued to see in it a metaphor of the soul's journey, bright but elusive, necessary but dangerous. One manuscript, copied in the Low Countries around 1420, included this reflection. Consider the quicksilver, how it flees from thy grasp, yet binds itself to gold. Thus the spirit, uncontained, seeks union with what is noble. To the faithful, such words justify the risks. If mercury could transmute base metals, could it not also transmute the base aspects of man himself? As skepticism grew, so too did efforts to defend the old traditions. Some alchemists became more secretive, resorting to ever more elaborate ciphers. Others took to traveling again, seeking new patrons far from the centers of learning. There were even attempts to reconcile the promise of mercury with the emerging sciences. In Germany, the physician Ulrich von Andernach suggested that mercury might indeed have the power to prolong life, not as a supernatural elixir, but as a potent purifier that, when used in minuscule quantities, could cleanse the humors. He argued that mercury's danger was simply proof of its potency. All that hath the virtue to heal hath likewise the power to harm. Such views tried to bridge old and new, to maintain the hope of transformation while acknowledging the need for caution. Meanwhile, in the courts of Europe, curiosity remained. Wealthy patrons were reluctant to surrender the idea that a single substance could unlock nature's secrets. Reports circulated of new tinctures prepared in secret workshops, of fresh attempts to create the mercury of the philosophers. Some were earnest, others little more than confident schemes. In Florence, an ambitious alchemist named Piero di Lorenzo claimed to have perfected a method to refine mercury into a living essence capable of restoring youth. He secured funding from a minor duke who hoped to regain vigor in old age. The result was predictable. No miracle occurred, and Piero vanished before repayment could be demanded. Such episodes only fed public suspicion. Among the literate classes, satirical poems and pamphlets began to appear, mocking the figure of the alchemist as a deluded old man hunched over his furnace, squandering fortunes in pursuit of vanity. It would be a mistake to imagine that the dream simply collapsed. Even as criticism mounted, many quietly continued their experiments. The libraries still held their secrets. The recipes still passed from mentor to apprentice. In truth, skepticism and belief were not enemies so much as twins. Each depended on the other to define itself. The skeptics needed the alchemists to measure their own rationality. The alchemists needed the skeptics to prove that their knowledge was precious, worth guarding, worth suffering for. By the end of the 15th century, the first printed books of natural philosophy were beginning to circulate. They promised clarity, order, and classification. In their pages, mercury was listed among substances to be measured and categorized, no longer a mystery, but an element of interest. And yet, in the margins of these same books, anonymous hands continued to scribble old symbols. The dragon devouring its tail, the twin serpents coiled around a cup, the lunar crescent crowned with a star. The old language had not died. It had simply moved deeper underground. In the next chapter, we will follow that hidden current into the Renaissance, when a new generation would attempt to reconcile the alchemical dreams of the past with the systematic inquiry of the future. For if mercury was losing its luster in learned halls, it was finding new life in the workshops of Renaissance experimenters. And so, the story continued, a shimmer in the flask, a promise in the mind, never quite extinguished. Chapter 9. A Renaissance of Silver. As Europe crossed the threshold of the 16th century, the world seemed to be awakening from a long medieval slumber. New continents appeared on maps. New philosophies challenged old certainties. New instruments, lenses, balances, furnaces, promised a deeper knowledge of nature than ever before. And amid all this upheaval, the allure of Mercury did not vanish. It simply adapted. This era, so often called the Renaissance, brought with it a reinvention of alchemy itself. In Italy, Germany, and the Low Countries, scholars began to compile vast compendia of alchemical lore, attempting to reconcile centuries of secret practice with the emerging ideals of clarity and systematic observation. One of the towering figures of this transformation was Paracelsus, a Swiss physician whose reputation for brilliance was matched only by his appetite for controversy. Paracelsus believed passionately that medicine must be grounded in the study of nature, not the rote repetition of ancient texts. He insisted that every disease had a specific cause, and that every remedy must be tailored to that cause. In this spirit, he rejected much of Galenic medicine. But when it came to Mercury, he remained convinced of its central place in the drama of life and death. Paracelsus called Mercury Mercurius, and he considered it not merely a metal, but a fundamental principle. In his writings, he described three primary substances, mercury, sulfur, and salt, that together composed all matter. Mercury stood for volatility and fluidity, the animating spirit that moved through all things. Without it, there could be no transformation. His influence was immense. Where earlier alchemists had spoken in riddles, Paracelsus attempted to forge a new language, one that could bridge the gap between alchemical tradition and practical medicine. In the city of Basel, he demonstrated mercury's therapeutic potential by using mercurial compounds to treat syphilis, a disease that had spread rapidly across Europe. Though his methods were harsh by modern standards, patients were sometimes exposed to mercury fumes or given mercury pills. Many credited him with offering the first effective treatment for a scourge that terrified the continent. For Paracelsus and his followers, the fact that mercury could cure such a formidable illness seemed proof that it contained a force beyond ordinary matter, a force that could, in principle, be refined into an elixir of health and perhaps even longevity. This was not merely speculation. In workshops and apothecaries across Europe, practitioners experimented tirelessly with mercury's myriad forms. Calomel, a mercurous chloride, cinnabar, the deep red, or sublimed mercury, gathered from heated retorts in shimmering droplets. The old allegories persisted, Mercury as a dragon or a moon. But now they mingled with a more precise, almost clinical curiosity. In Florence, the polymath Bernardo Cattaneo wrote of his attempts to purify mercury into what he called the quinta essentia, or fifth essence, which he believed could rejuvenate the body's vital energies. He left behind a series of notebooks describing experiments with distillation, filtration, and repeated sublimation. Though he never claimed to have achieved immortality, his notes reveal an unshakable faith that the answer lay somewhere within the silver liquid. Meanwhile, in Nuremberg and Augsburg, skilled artisans known as alchemical glassblowers perfected the design of alembics and retorts, allowing for more controlled experiments. Glass, once an expensive luxury, was becoming more accessible. For the first time, it was possible to watch mercury's transformations unfold in transparent vessels, an innovation that felt almost magical. The sight must have been mesmerizing. Mercury rising as vapor, condensing in mirrored beads, trickling back down the curved neck of the flask. A substance that refused to be pinned down, always shifting between states, embodying the mystery of life itself. Yet even as alchemical practice grew more sophisticated, it remained shadowed by controversy. Paracelsus died in 1541, leaving behind admirers and enemies in equal measure. His advocacy of mercury treatments inspired generations of physicians, but also horrified traditional healers who saw them as reckless. Mercury's toxicity was becoming impossible to ignore. Apothecaries began recording the long-term effects of chronic exposure: trembling hands, blackened gums, confusion, hallucinations. Some of Paracelsus's patients recovered from syphilis only to fall victim to Mercury's slow, corrosive grip. And so, the paradox deepened. The very substance that seemed to promise healing and transformation also brought suffering and decay. For every success story, there were whispered tragedies. For every treatise extolling Mercury's virtues, there was a pamphlet condemning its dangers. Yet no amount of skepticism could fully extinguish the dream. In the courts of the Medici, the Habsburgs, and the Tudors, wealthy patrons continued to commission alchemists to seek the perfect preparation. The form of Mercury so pure, so elevated, that would cleanse rather than poison, transform rather than destroy. In Prague, Emperor Rudolf II, who would later become the greatest patron of alchemy in Europe, began collecting treatises and instruments. Though Rudolf's reign lay still ahead, his fascination had roots in this Renaissance moment, when Mercury was no longer simply a metal or a myth, but a bridge between the old world and the new. By the late 1500s, the printing press had begun to spread alchemical texts beyond monastic and noble libraries. Manuals, recipes, and philosophical treatises found their way into the hands of merchants, apothecaries, and curious laypeople. Mercury, once hidden behind locked cabinets, became part of a wider conversation about nature, medicine, and the human longing to outwit mortality. In some circles, this democratization was cause for celebration. Knowledge, after all, belonged to everyone. But among the old guilds and secretive brotherhoods, there was a growing fear that Mercury's secrets were being cheapened, turned into mere novelty, stripped of their sacred gravity. One anonymous alchemist, writing in 1599, lamented, "Now every fool dabbles with quicksilver and calls himself a philosopher. They know not that it is a mirror of the soul, reflecting their ignorance as surely as it reflects their face." Even in this moment of transition, when science and folklore mingled, when experimentation and superstition clashed, Mercury retained its power to fascinate. For at its heart, the mystery remained unsolved. Could this bright, shifting element, so lethal and so alluring, truly contain the secret of transformation? Or was it simply a mirror, showing each seeker what he most desired to see? In the next chapter, we will turn to the life of Emperor Rudolf II, whose passion for alchemy and Mercury would transform Prague into the last great theater of medieval aspiration and the first stage of modern science. For now, picture the workshops of Renaissance Europe, glass vessels glinting in candlelight, bearded scholars peering into swirling vapor, and Mercury, forever dancing between promise and peril. Chapter 10. Rudolf's Dream of Transmutation. If there was a single ruler whose life embodied the twilight of medieval alchemy and the dawn of modern science, it was Emperor Rudolf II. From the late 16th century into the first decades of the 17th, Rudolf presided over the Holy Roman Empire from his palace in Prague. Though he wielded vast political power, he was far more captivated by a quieter pursuit: the ancient promise that Mercury held the key to transforming both matter and the human condition. Rudolf was not the first Habsburg to take an interest in alchemy, but he was the first to make it the centerpiece of a court culture. Where other rulers commissioned an occasional treatise or employed a single alchemist, Rudolf built an entire ecosystem devoted to the pursuit of transmutation. His chambers overflowed with manuscripts, strange apparatuses, mineral samples, and cryptic diagrams. He assembled a library that included Greek, Arabic, and Latin alchemical texts, many of which had never before left monastery walls. Mercury was the beating heart of Rudolf's fascination. In the imperial workshops, glass alembics glinted in the candlelight, perpetually distilling and condensing the silvery liquid. Scribes and secretaries scurried through halls carrying vials of mercury to and fro, each labeled in Rudolf's neat hand with the symbol of the planet Mercury. a stylized serpent coiled around a cross. To the emperor, Mercury was more than a material curiosity. It was an emblem of hidden power. He believed it could purify base metals, heal infirmities, and perhaps even extend life itself. Visitors to the court sometimes described the atmosphere as a mixture of scholarly intensity and religious devotion. A Venetian envoy reported, "The emperor keeps a chamber where none may enter, filled with furnaces and glasses, and he speaks of the quicksilver as if it were a spirit." Among the dozens of alchemists Rudolf patronized, the most famous was Edward Kelly, an Englishman whose reputation was as luminous and as questionable as Mercury itself. Kelly arrived in Prague alongside the mathematician and astrologer John Dee. While Dee returned to England, Kelly remained, capturing Rudolph's imagination with his promises of transmutation. In Kelly's hands, Mercury became both a lure and a weapon. He claimed to possess a red powder, a substance he called the tincture, which, when combined with mercury, could turn lead into gold. He performed several demonstrations that appeared to confirm his claims. On one occasion, before a small audience of imperial counselors, Kelly allegedly produced a bead of gold from a crucible where mercury had been heated. The counselors gasped. Rudolph ordered more supplies. Whether Kelly's feats were genuine, sleight of hand, or somewhere between, no one could say for certain. What mattered was the effect. Rudolph was convinced that the final steps of the great work were within reach. He was not alone in that hope. Across Europe, the reports of Kelly's transmutations revived old dreams. Pamphlets circulated describing the miracles of Mercury. Merchants in Nuremberg and Venice began stockpiling cinnabar in hopes of selling it to alchemists eager to replicate Kelly's successes. In Florence, a group of scholars pooled funds to commission their own search for the elusive tincture. Within Rudolph's palace, the fever reached its height. Courtiers jostled for appointments to the alchemical laboratories. Goldsmiths and physicians were summoned to witness experiments. Scribal teams copied arcane recipes late into the night. And all the while, mercury flowed, spooned into crucibles, heated in retorts, brushed onto metal sheets. Yet the dream of transformation proved elusive. For every triumph Kelly claimed, there were rumors of failures. When pressed for proof of lasting success, he demurred, insisting that the process was delicate beyond imagining, that the tincture required ever more refinement. He asked for additional funds, more privacy, more time. Eventually, Rudolph's patience began to fray. But his belief in Mercury's potential did not. Even after Kelly fell out of favor and was imprisoned, Rudolph continued to support other alchemists, convinced that the right combination of skill and sincerity could unlock the final secret. This conviction shaped the culture of Prague. The imperial city became a magnet for scholars, mystics, and charlatans from every corner of Europe. In the narrow lanes around Hradčany Castle, one could find furnaces glowing behind shuttered windows at all hours. The air smelled of sulfur, vinegar, and the metallic tang of mercury vapor. Foreign ambassadors wrote home that the emperor had transformed Prague into a kingdom of philosophers. Yet for all the fervor, no philosopher's stone materialized. The quicksilver remained quicksilver, elusive, shimmering, impossible to tame. Rudolph's obsession grew more private as the years passed. He began to spend long hours alone in his chamber of curiosities, surrounded by strange artifacts. Automata that clicked and whirred, illuminated manuscripts filled with celestial diagrams, and cabinets crowded with flasks of mercury sealed under wax. He confided to one chronicler that he sometimes dreamed of the mercury speaking to him, whispering secrets no other mind could hear. Meanwhile, outside the palace, the currents of change quickened. The first stirrings of the scientific revolution were emerging. Men like Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler, both of whom worked in Rudolph's orbit, were laying the foundations for modern astronomy. Experiment and observation were replacing allegory as the preferred tools of inquiry. Yet even these pioneers did not dismiss alchemy outright. Kepler himself wrote cautiously about the possibility that nature concealed deeper transformations than any telescope could reveal. If Mercury was not the literal key to immortality, perhaps it still held lessons about the hidden unity of matter. After Rudolph's death in 1612, the imperial workshops fell silent. Some of the apparatus was sold. Some manuscripts disappeared into private collections. But the legend of Prague as the last great alchemical court endured. For generations, travelers would tell tales of the emperor who spent his fortune seeking the secret of silver fire. Historians have often judged Rudolph harshly, portraying him as a gullible dreamer who wasted vast resources on illusions. And yet, to understand him is to glimpse the enduring appeal of Mercury. For in its flickering surface, Rudolph saw a reflection of every hope and anxiety that haunted humanity: the yearning for mastery over decay, the hunger for transcendence, the dread of impermanence. He was neither the first nor the last to be captivated. Long after the imperial furnaces went cold, the idea persisted that Mercury, refined beyond corruption, might yield a glimpse of something eternal. In the next chapter, we will follow the twilight of alchemy as it gradually yielded to the rise of modern chemistry. It still left its traces in the laboratories and imaginations of those who came after. And so the story continued, quicksilver flowing through the centuries, a bright thread of longing unbroken by failure. Chapter 11. The Alchemist's Legacy. As the 17th century progressed, the winds of change swept more forcefully across Europe. The old medieval frameworks that had sustained alchemy began to fracture under the strain of new ideas. Empiricism, mechanistic philosophy, and the systematic skepticism of the early scientific societies. And yet, like a river that carves new channels rather than disappearing altogether, alchemy persisted in unexpected forms. Mercury, that restless metal, continued to haunt laboratories and imaginations alike. It had been central to the aspirations of emperors and monks, but now it found itself in the hands of a new breed of experimenters, natural philosophers determined to scrutinize every phenomenon, to reduce each transformation to cause and effect. One of the figures emblematic of this transition was Robert Boyle. Born in 1627 into wealth and privilege, Boyle grew up fascinated by stories of the philosopher's stone. Yet even as he absorbed the old alchemical tales, he cultivated an equally fervent dedication to careful observation. His laboratory in Oxford was a place where the tools of medieval alchemy mingled with the precision of modern science. Boyle did not dismiss Mercury as superstition. Instead, he subjected it to the same scrutiny he applied to all matter. In his writings, he described Mercury's unique ability to dissolve gold, a property that had mesmerized generations of alchemists. He noted its volatility and its power to amalgamate with other metals. But rather than interpret these behaviors as evidence of hidden spirit, Boyle treated them as data to be cataloged, tested, and repeated. In this way, Mercury became a bridge between two eras, a relic of mystical aspiration and a substance ripe for scientific investigation. For Boyle and others in the newly founded Royal Society, the goal was not to abandon alchemy wholesale, but to sift it, retaining what could be demonstrated and discarding the rest. At the same time, the cultural memory of Mercury's promise proved impossible to erase. Across Europe, printers continued to issue alchemical manuals, sometimes in luxurious editions with elaborate engravings. One of the most popular was Theatrum Chemicum, a multi-volume collection that preserved centuries of recipes, allegories, and theories. In its pages, Mercury still appeared as the secret fire, ignis occultus, the first principle of all transmutation. Even as the language of science grew more rigorous, this older symbolism retained its appeal. The idea that Mercury might embody a cosmic duality, fluid yet substantial, cleansing yet corrupting, spoke to yearnings that no microscope could fully extinguish. Among the artisans and practitioners outside academic circles, Mercury remained indispensable. Goldsmiths used it to gild objects. Mirror makers relied on it to produce the flawless reflections prized in wealthy homes. Apothecaries, despite mounting warnings, continued to prepare mercury-based ointments to treat skin diseases and syphilis. In some rural corners of Europe, folk healers still whispered that mercury, taken in precisely measured doses, could extend life. Yet the risks were increasingly undeniable. Chronic mercury poisoning left unmistakable signs: trembling limbs, drooling, memory loss, hallucinations. In mining communities where cinnabar was extracted, entire families sickened. Physicians began to recognize that the same substance prized for its transformative promise could be a slow-acting curse. This tension between promise and peril wove itself into the stories people told. In Nuremberg, a pamphlet appeared recounting the cautionary tale of an anonymous practitioner who spent his fortune in search of the philosopher's stone and died with nothing but flasks of mercury and a heart full of regret. In Venice, a playwright composed a satire lampooning the figure of the aged alchemist, so blinded by visions of immortality that he failed to notice his own decay. Yet there were other, more sympathetic portrayals. In paintings and engravings, the alchemist often appeared as a figure of quiet dignity, stooped over his furnace, pursuing knowledge that might one day redeem humanity's frailty. Even in failure, there was something noble in the quest. In some respects, mercury itself became a symbol for the spirit of inquiry, ever-changing, resistant to final certainty. This metaphor was not lost on Boyle and his contemporaries. They recognized that the same substance that inspired delusion had also inspired curiosity, and that curiosity was the seed of genuine discovery. By the late 1600s, the intellectual landscape had changed almost beyond recognition. Galileo had turned his telescope skyward. Descartes had proposed a new philosophy grounded in doubt and reason, and Newton was preparing to publish his Principia Mathematica. The mechanistic worldview was supplanting the organic metaphors of medieval thought. Yet even Newton, the towering figure of modern science, was not immune to Mercury's fascination. In the privacy of his study, he devoted thousands of pages to alchemical experimentation, much of it focused on refining mercury into more perfect forms. He believed that hidden within matter were transformative principles, signatures of divine order waiting to be unveiled. These secret notebooks would not come to light until centuries later, but they reveal how thin the boundary was between the new science and the old longing. If the alchemists had erred, it was not always in their observations, but in the stories they wove around them, stories of endless life and incorruptible matter. The laboratories of Europe were growing more orderly, their experiments more repeatable, but the question that had driven medieval alchemists had not disappeared. What if there was a single substance capable of bridging the gulf between corruption and perfection? Mercury, for all its dangers, remained the likeliest candidate. In Prague, the memory of Rudolf II lingered. Visitors to the Hradčany still told tales of his locked chambers filled with mercury glass and illuminated manuscripts. Some said that in hidden vaults, Rudolf's last experiments continued in secret, tended by descendants of his alchemists. Whether or not the stories were true, they spoke to the persistence of the dream. Throughout the 17th century, as chemistry slowly emerged as a distinct discipline, practitioners continued to wrestle with mercury's double nature. It was indispensable in experiments and industry, yet also a reminder of the human tendency to hope beyond evidence. When the Royal Society convened debates about the legitimacy of alchemy, mercury occupied a central place in their discussions. Could its unique properties be explained by corpuscular theory alone? Or did it conceal a deeper principle, as the old texts insisted? The arguments often ended inconclusively. Mercury refused to yield all its secrets. In this ambiguity lay its enduring power. It was neither wholly discredited nor fully understood, a perfect emblem of the threshold between medieval wonder and modern knowledge. As the century drew to a close, the laboratories grew quieter. The age of mystical transmutation was ending. But the legacy of Mercury and the longing it inspired would ripple forward into the next era. In the next chapter, we will see how the Industrial Revolution harnessed mercury for new purposes, and how the memory of alchemical dreams continued to haunt even the most practical minds. For now, imagine those dim workshops, their shelves lined with flasks of quicksilver, their air thick with hope and uncertainty. The alchemists had not found immortality, but in seeking it, they had laid the groundwork for discoveries yet to come. Chapter 12. Mercury in the Age of Industry. As Europe entered the 18th century, the world was transforming at a pace that would have astonished the old alchemists. Steam engines drove looms and hammers. Canals linked inland towns to far-flung ports, and scientific academies proliferated in every major city. Knowledge was no longer the preserve of monks and noble patrons. It was becoming the currency of an ambitious middle class determined to remake society in the image of reason and progress. Yet amid this swirl of innovation, mercury retained its place in laboratories, workshops, and imaginations. While the grand dreams of the philosopher's stone had faded from serious discourse, mercury's practical value had never been greater. The Industrial Revolution found uses for quicksilver that would have startled even Paracelsus. In metallurgy, mercury became essential to refining gold and silver. The process known as amalgamation, long understood by alchemists, was now applied on an industrial scale. Miners in Spain and the Americas crushed, or in a fine powder, poured mercury over it, and then heated the mixture to drive off the quicksilver and leave behind precious metal. This method yielded immense profits, but also exacted a terrible cost. In the mining districts of Almaden, Huancavelica, and Potosi, entire communities were exposed to mercury vapor. Chronic poisoning manifested in trembling limbs, blackened gums, and minds clouded by hallucinations. The alchemists had always known mercury was dangerous, but in the age of industry, its dangers reached a scale previously unimaginable. For physicians and chemists, mercury's properties became a subject of rigorous study. No longer hidden behind allegory, the element was dissected, weighed, and analyzed. French chemist Antoine Lavoisier classified mercury as a true element rather than a compound. He noted its high density, its low melting point, and its peculiar capacity to combine with sulfur to create vivid red cinnabar. To Lavoisier, mercury exemplified the promise of chemical analysis, a discipline that could replace superstition with quantifiable knowledge. Yet even in this new era of clarity, echoes of the old dreams persisted. In pamphlets and popular literature, mercury remained a symbol of transformation. A London almanac from 1755 advised readers that mercury's fluidity made it the emblem of life's constant motion, while a Parisian encyclopedia described it as the spirit of change made manifest. In the hands of artisans, mercury took on more mundane but no less important roles. Mirror makers perfected the technique of laying mercury behind glass to create the brilliant reflections that adorned the homes of Europe's rising bourgeoisie. Apothecaries continued to prepare mercury compounds, most famously calomel, or mercurous chloride, which doctors prescribed as a purgative. Though calomel's side effects were severe, many physicians believed that no other substance matched its potency in cleansing the humors. Meanwhile, alchemical texts still circulated among the curious and the credulous. Even as chemistry advanced, there remained a market for compendia of hermetic knowledge. Some readers pored over them in hope of discovering hidden recipes. Others approached them as curiosities, a window into an age when the boundaries between science, philosophy, and faith had been more porous. In this period, the image of the alchemist began to shift decisively in public imagination. No longer portrayed as a tragic seeker, he was often depicted as a figure of folly, the old man with a long beard, squinting into his furnace, convinced he was on the brink of immortality. Painters like Joseph Wright of Derby captured this ambivalence. In his famous canvas, The Alchemist Discovering Phosphorus, Wright showed the alchemist bathed in an eerie glow, part visionary, part madman. The quicksilver on the shelves gleamed in the firelight, a reminder that for all his learning, the alchemist remained captivated by a mystery that science was rapidly demystifying. Yet the story was not so simple. In the laboratories of practical chemistry, mercury remained indispensable. In metallurgy, medicine, glassmaking, and even early electrical experiments, it played a role no other element could fulfill. When Benjamin Franklin devised his instruments for studying static electricity, he used mercury to create conductive contacts. When early thermometer makers sought a substance that expanded predictably with heat, they turned again to mercury. The old metaphor of mercury as a bridge between realms took on new significance. No longer a bridge between life and death, or base and noble metals, it had become a bridge between the medieval and the modern, a substance that had carried human curiosity across centuries. Yet even in this more prosaic role, mercury retained its unsettling duality. In 1783, a young German physician named Samuel Hahnemann recorded his unease after treating patients with mercury ointments. "I cannot reconcile myself to the thought that a remedy so violent to the body could be meant as a true medicine. It seems to me more a scourge than a cure." Hahnemann's doubts would eventually contribute to the birth of homeopathy, a doctrine that rejected large doses of mercury and other harsh substances. But for most practitioners, the benefits still outweighed the risks. In the final decades of the 18th century, the pace of change accelerated. Chemistry emerged as a recognized profession, distinct from alchemy and from mere apothecary craft. Public demonstrations of chemical phenomena became popular entertainments in cities like Paris and London. Audiences marveled as lecturers showed mercury's transformations, the bright beads rolling across glass, the vapor condensing into silvery droplets, the amalgams that turned soft and buttery under heat. To these spectators, mercury represented the triumph of knowledge over mystery. But to a few, it still hinted at something more profound, a reminder that nature's most familiar substances could conceal secrets beyond imagining. In Prague, the memory of Rudolph II had not faded. Visitors to the old castle claimed that in its deepest vaults, mercury flasks remained sealed under imperial wax, waiting for a future generation to unlock their secrets. Whether this was true or folklore, the tale spoke to an enduring hunger for transformation. By 1800, the word alchemy had become almost synonymous with folly. Yet the discipline it inspired, chemistry, was on the cusp of discoveries that would transform the world. Hydrogen and oxygen had been identified. The composition of air was understood. Soon, electricity would reveal its own hidden powers. And in all of this, mercury played a quiet but essential part. As the 19th century dawned, it was clear that the old dreams of immortality were receding. Yet the fascination remained. In its shimmering, liquid form, mercury still evoked the alchemist's faith that matter itself could be coaxed to reveal a more perfect nature. In the next chapter, we will explore how mercury's legacy shaped the industrial age and how, even as the old myths faded, the element continued to inspire both caution and wonder. For now, imagine the laboratories of the Enlightenment, bright with glassware and brass instruments, filled with the scent of burning charcoal and quicksilver vapor. The alchemist's dream had not disappeared. It had simply changed its face. Chapter 13. A Dangerous Partner in Progress. The 19th century arrived in a roar of invention. Steam locomotives shrieked along new railways. Telegraph wires began to pulse with invisible messages. Great cities rose on iron frameworks. In this world of engines and empiricism, it might have seemed there was no longer room for old alchemical longings. But mercury did not fade into obscurity. Instead, it found itself woven ever more deeply into the fabric of modern life, no longer as a symbol of immortality, but as a tool that helped power the age of progress. In laboratories and factories alike, mercury proved indispensable. Chemists discovered it could be used to produce chlorine and caustic soda in large quantities, substances vital to the textile and paper industries. Instrument makers prized it for its predictable thermal expansion. With mercury-filled thermometers, engineers could now measure temperature precisely, whether in a locomotive boiler or a chemical vat. Mercury also enabled one of the most important innovations in electrical science. In the 1830s, researchers experimenting with the nascent technology of the electric telegraph needed a reliable conductor that would maintain contact as metal wires shifted and vibrated. Mercury proved ideal. When the first telegraph lines connected distant towns, they did so with the help of quicksilver contacts, glistening inside glass tubes. Meanwhile, in medicine, mercury retained its controversial prominence. Calomel remained a standard purgative, administered in doses that would now be unthinkable. Dentists filled cavities with amalgams of mercury and silver, a practice that offered relief to patients suffering from agonizing decay, though it quietly sowed the seeds of debate about long-term health risks. In mining and metallurgy, mercury's old alchemical role was reborn at industrial scale. During the great gold rushes in California and Australia, prospectors relied on mercury to extract fine gold from crushed ore. Entire rivers were sluiced through wooden troughs lined with mercury. The resulting amalgam was heated to drive off the liquid metal, leaving behind the coveted gleam of gold. This method made fortunes, but also left landscapes poisoned. In California, Sierra Nevada, observers noted that the soil along the rivers turned lifeless, the air thick with acrid fumes. Fish and birds perished in alarming numbers. Mercury, the element that once symbolized the hope of transcending nature, had become an agent of its degradation. Yet even amid such devastation, the old allure never fully vanished. Popular writers continued to describe mercury in near-mystical terms. Scientific journals published sober articles about its chemical properties, but pamphlets and penny newspapers still indulged in romantic tales of its hidden powers. One London printer in 1851 offered a booklet titled The Silver Spirit, an inquiry into the alchemical secrets of mercury. Though its text was more fanciful than factual, it sold briskly to an audience still fascinated by the notion that the ancient metal might harbor truths science had yet to discover. In more reputable circles, researchers approached mercury with growing caution. Medical societies began to question the wisdom of heavy calomel dosing. Industrial chemists recorded cases of workers developing tremors and hallucinations. Yet regulation was slow to come. Mercury was simply too useful to abandon. The paradox was inescapable. A substance once sought as the fountain of health and immortality was proving itself a hazard as much as a helper. Mercury's dual nature made it a fitting symbol of the 19th century itself. This was an age of breathtaking progress, but also of unintended consequences, of prosperity built upon practices that would one day be judged unsustainable. And still, in quiet corners of Europe, the old alchemical traditions flickered. In Paris, a circle of spiritualists and esoteric philosophers gathered in candlelit salons to revive Hermetic doctrines. They spoke of mercury as an astral fluid, a medium through which the energies of the cosmos might be conducted into human life. In London, private presses reissued translations of medieval alchemical treatises, their engraved symbols as inscrutable as ever. Some scientists scoffed. Others looked on with ambivalence. For all the scorn heaped on the alchemists, it was hard to deny that their questions about the unity of matter, the possibility of transformation, still resonated. Even most rigorous chemists could not help but feel a flicker of wonder watching mercury bead and roll across glass. One such observer was Michael Faraday, whose electrical experiments laid the foundation for much of modern technology. Faraday approached mercury strictly as a conductive medium. But in his private correspondence, he sometimes reflected on its uncanny qualities. It is, he wrote in 1842, as if the metal were half alive. By the late 1800s, scientific understanding had advanced in ways the old alchemists could never have imagined. Atomic theory was taking shape. Spectroscopy had revealed that each element had a unique signature. Mercury's bright spectral lines, yellow, green, and violet, became tools for analysis rather than tokens of cosmic mystery. Yet, even as it was dissected and categorized, Mercury retained a peculiar magnetism. It was indispensable to the precision instruments of modern chemistry. It gleamed in the thermometers that regulated steam engines and hospitals alike. And it haunted the public imagination as the lingering echo of an age when matter itself seemed capable of miracles. Toward the century's end, reformers and health advocates began to campaign more vigorously against the unregulated use of mercury. Reports from mining regions and industrial districts left little doubt about its hazards. Slowly, legislation emerged to restrict mercury emissions and protect workers from the worst exposures. In some ways, this was the final demystification of quicksilver. It was no longer an emblem of hope or a conduit of transmutation. It was an industrial chemical, valuable, yes, but also dangerous, requiring management and respect. Yet to the curious observer, mercury still seemed to shimmer with something more. Perhaps it was simply the weight of centuries of stories, or the elemental strangeness of its liquid form. Perhaps it was a reminder that no substance, however well understood, could be entirely stripped of wonder. In Prague, the old legends of Rudolph II remained alive in popular histories. Guides led tourists through the castle's echoing halls, recounting how the emperor dreamed of distilling an elixir that would conquer decay itself. They pointed to the hidden alcoves said to have once housed mercury-filled retorts. Whether the stories were true or embroidered with time, they spoke to an enduring fascination. As the 19th century yielded to the 20th, humanity stood poised to uncover still deeper structures of matter. Atoms, electrons, the secret fire of radioactivity. And yet, the story of Mercury remained a reminder that the hunger to transcend mortality had not vanished. It had simply adopted new vocabularies and new technologies. In the next chapter, we will watch Mercury enter the modern era, becoming part of scientific breakthroughs and public controversies alike. For now, picture the laboratories and factories of the industrial age. Furnaces roaring, glass retorts glinting, and quicksilver flowing. A substance that embodied both progress and peril in equal measure. Chapter 14. Mercury and the New Frontiers of Knowledge. By the early 20th century, the world had grown stranger than any medieval alchemist could have conceived. In laboratories across Europe and America, scientists probed the atom itself, discovering forces more powerful and more dangerous than mercury had ever suggested. Radioactivity, X-rays, and subatomic particles opened realms of knowledge that blurred the line between transformation and annihilation. Yet even in this era of unprecedented discovery, mercury retained its special status, no longer as the philosopher's key to immortality, but as a critical tool in the unfolding drama of modern science. In the laboratories of Marie and Pierre Curie, mercury featured quietly among the many substances they measured and weighed. The Curies were not searching for the elixir of life, but for invisible rays that emanated from uranium ores. They used mercury barometers and mercury-filled devices to detect minute changes in air pressure and temperature, factors that could affect their delicate experiments. Other researchers found more dramatic uses. Mercury became central to the study of electricity and magnetism. In 1914, American physicist Albert Michelson used mercury in an evacuated chamber to create a reference light source for measuring the speed of light. His work, building on earlier experiments by Maxwell and Hertz, would help confirm Einstein's theories of relativity. Mercury's role as a precision material was also visible in industry. The invention of the mercury arc rectifier, a device that converted alternating current to direct current, made it possible to transmit electricity over long distances without the energy losses that plagued earlier systems. In cavernous power stations, glass bulbs the size of barrels glowed with blue light, as mercury vapor conducted vast currents. Yet the same qualities that made mercury valuable made it increasingly controversial. Doctors had long known of its dangers, but the scale of modern exposure magnified the risk. Workers in thermometer factories and rectifier plants began to exhibit familiar symptoms: tremors, anxiety, memory loss. In 1926, a British medical journal published an alarming report titled Chronic Mercury Poisoning in Industry, warning that without safeguards, entire communities could be affected. Mercury also persisted in medicine. Despite growing caution, mercurial compounds were still widely used to treat syphilis and skin infections. The most notorious example was mercury bichloride, known as corrosive sublimate, which doctors applied as an antiseptic. In some hospitals, mercury's pungent odor became synonymous with cleanliness and modern treatment, even as its toxicity remained poorly understood. Yet even in this age of pragmatic science, old associations lingered. Some physicians spoke of mercury almost with reverence, as if it still retained a whisper of the transformative power the alchemists had pursued. In medical lectures, one might hear the phrase the noble metal, a holdover from centuries when mercury was not just a chemical, but an emblem of hidden possibilities. Beyond laboratories and clinics, mercury took on new cultural meanings. As psychology developed into a formal discipline, researchers searching for metaphors to describe the fluidity of thought and emotion often borrowed the image of mercury. Writers likened consciousness itself to quicksilver, shifting, reflective, impossible to pin down. In literature and art, mercury appeared again and again as a symbol of modernity's contradictions. In Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, set in a sanatorium filled with medical devices, the air is thick with the sense that science can both heal and dehumanize. Mercury thermometers stand as quiet witnesses to a larger unease. The fear that humanity's quest to master nature might ultimately estrange it from itself. By the mid-20th century, as the devastation of World War gave way to the anxieties of the nuclear age, mercury acquired yet another role, a substance essential to new technologies of measurement and control. During the Manhattan Project, engineers used mercury to produce high-purity uranium for atomic bombs. Mercury diffusion pumps helped maintain the vacuum conditions necessary for isotope separation. In this setting, mercury was no longer a symbol of salvation. It had become, if anything, an accessory to the most destructive force ever unleashed. The irony was striking. Once prized by alchemists as a path to perfection, mercury was now part of the machinery of annihilation. At the same time, environmental awareness was beginning to rise. In the 1950s, fishermen in Minamata, Japan, began to notice strange behavior among cats and seabirds. Soon, villagers developed tremors and slurred speech. Investigators discovered that industrial runoff containing methylmercury, a form of mercury far more toxic than the old practitioners ever imagined, had contaminated the bay. The tragedy of Minamata would become one of the first and most powerful examples of industrial pollution awakening a global consciousness of ecological fragility. In the wake of such disasters, mercury's reputation changed. Once a beacon of human ingenuity, it came to symbolize the unforeseen costs of technological ambition. Regulations tightened. Factories adapted. Yet the paradox remained. Mercury was too useful to abandon entirely. In batteries, fluorescent lamps, and scientific equipment, it remained indispensable. Even in this chastened era, a few voices still invoked the older symbolism. In philosophical essays, mercury reappeared as a metaphor for the tension between mastery and humility. One German writer observed, "What other element so perfectly expresses our divided nature? Our brilliance and our blindness." Meanwhile, historians of science began to re-examine the alchemists with more sympathy. No longer dismissed as mere charlatans, they were increasingly seen as early explorers of chemical reality, people who, despite their errors, laid the groundwork for modern methods. Mercury, in this reassessment, appeared less as a delusion and more as a bridge between eras, from a mysticism of the Middle Ages to the precision of the atomic age. As the century drew to a close, Mercury continued to be a focus of scientific fascination. Researchers studied its role in neurological disorders. Engineers developed safer ways to handle and recycle it. Environmentalists campaigned for its complete phase-out. Yet in museums and libraries, the old alchemical manuscripts endured. On their yellowing pages, Mercury appeared in elaborate engravings: the serpent, the crescent moon, the crucible. These images reminded readers that for all our advances, some part of the human spirit remains forever drawn to transformation, to the hope that nature might yield up a secret capable of transcending mortality itself. In the next and final chapter, we will reflect on Mercury's journey across the centuries, from sacred elixir to industrial hazard, and ask what its story tells us about the deeper patterns of human curiosity and desire. For now, picture the laboratories of the mid-20th century, fluorescent lights shining on glass flasks, protective masks hanging on hooks, mercury shimmering in its sealed chambers. It is the same substance that once gleamed in alchemists' dreams. Only now, its dangers and its powers are both more clearly seen. Chapter 15. The Shimmering Legacy. As the 21st century dawned, Mercury's long story entered a new chapter, one that no alchemist could ever have foreseen. For the first time in history, nations gathered to sign treaties not to share Mercury's secrets, but to limit its use. The Minamata Convention on Mercury, adopted in 2013, was named for the coastal Japanese town whose suffering had awakened the world to the metal's hazards. The agreement sought to phase out mercury in many industrial processes, to restrict emissions, and to prevent the poisoning of future generations. It was in some ways the final reversal of the old dream. Mercury was no longer an emblem of triumph over nature, but a reminder of how easily ambition could outrun caution. Yet even amid these new constraints, Mercury's ancient allure persisted. In laboratories devoted to material science, researchers continued to study its peculiar properties. They explored how mercury atoms arranged themselves into tight lattices under pressure, how the metal expanded and contracted in response to minute temperature shifts, how it could still outperform synthetic substitutes in some applications. In physics, mercury vapor helped refine atomic clocks, devices so precise they could measure time to the billionth of a second. These clocks guided satellites in orbit and synchronized digital networks across the globe. When technicians calibrated them, they handled mercury with a care that bordered on reverence. In this sterile environment, it was easy to forget the centuries of legend, the layers of myth that had once wrapped the metal in mystery. But for historians, those layers remained as fascinating as ever. In archives and private collections, the notebooks of medieval alchemists continued to yield their secrets. Scholars pored over crabbed Latin marginalia and coda recipes. They traced how the idea of mercury as a bridge between life and death spread from Arabic treatises into European monasteries. Some researchers saw in these texts the origins of experimental science itself. Others read them as allegories, spiritual metaphors rather than literal instructions. Still others believed the truth lay somewhere in between, that the alchemists' yearning to transmute base metals into gold was inseparable from their desire to transform the human condition. Even in our modern world, the deeper symbolism refused to fade. Mercury still evoked a strange mix of admiration and unease. It shimmered in our imaginations as a reminder that every substance carries more meaning than its chemical formula suggests. This enduring fascination was visible not only in science, but in culture. Artists continued to invoke Mercury's dual nature. In one installation at the Venice Biennale, a pool of liquid metal rippled beneath shifting lights, reflecting distorted images of viewers who leaned over it. The artist called it the mirror of desire, an allusion to the centuries when Mercury had been imagined as a gateway to transcendence. Writers and filmmakers, too, found in Mercury a potent symbol. In novels exploring the ethical dilemmas of biotechnology, Mercury sometimes appeared as a ghostly motif, a relic of an earlier era when people believed transformation was only a matter of unlocking the right secret. In documentaries about environmental disasters, Mercury's bright droplets became an image of human excess and unintended consequence. Yet perhaps the most poignant legacy of Mercury lay in the questions it continued to inspire. For all the warnings and regulations, some part of the human spirit still felt the pull of its liquid shimmer. Was this merely nostalgia, the residue of old superstitions? Or did it reflect something deeper? A recognition that transformation, whether material or spiritual, has always been our most enduring ambition? In universities, historians of science debated this very question. Some argued that alchemy should be seen not as a failed science, but as a kind of imaginative workshop, a place where philosophy, observation, and hope intertwined. In this reading, Mercury was never just a substance. It was a metaphor for possibility, for the fluidity of life itself. Meanwhile, chemists teaching undergraduates often found that Mercury retained a unique power to fascinate. Even students who considered themselves fully modern could not suppress a flicker of wonder when they saw a bead of mercury roll across glass, breaking into smaller globules before recombining into a perfect sphere. It was as if the metal was demonstrating, in miniature, the unity the alchemists had spent lifetimes seeking. In public museums, Mercury's story now occupied entire exhibitions. Visitors could trace its journey from the mines of Almaden to the retorts of medieval laboratories, from the gilded chambers of emperors to the industrial mills of the 19th century. Display cases held mercury thermometers, barometers, and gilded mirrors. Wall panels described the tragedies of Minamata and the efforts to control mercury spread. Yet for all the sober lessons, there was also a current of awe. People lingered longest over the illuminated manuscripts, the engraved diagrams of alembics and crucibles, the strange, half-forgotten symbols. In those symbols, one could glimpse the old belief that mercury was something more than mere matter, that it was a bridge between corruption and perfection, mortality and the hope of immortality. In this way, Mercury's story continued to echo the deeper story of humanity itself. We are creatures forever torn between pragmatism and wonder, between what is measurable and what is hoped for. We build technologies to improve our lives, yet we never entirely cease to long for transformation that transcends the material. If the medieval alchemists were mistaken about the philosopher's stone, they were not wrong in their intuition that nature conceals mysteries. Their error was not in seeking too much, but in imagining that the path to perfection could ever be simple. In the final reckoning, Mercury's long journey, from sacred elixir to industrial chemical, from emblem of redemption to emblem of caution, tells us less about the substance itself than about the people who shaped its meaning. It reminds us that knowledge and imagination are never truly separate, and that every attempt to master the material world contains, within it, the seeds of both hope and hubris. Today, as mercury is slowly retired from many of its old uses, it remains a shimmering relic of that ambition. In sealed flasks and carefully regulated instruments, it endures. Proof that even the most familiar elements can reflect our dreams as much as our needs. Perhaps that is the final lesson the alchemists unwittingly left us, that no matter how precise our measurements become, some part of our longing will always be impossible to distill or confine. Mercury, in its restless, luminous form, will remain an emblem of that longing, a mirror in which we glimpse not only the material world, but our desire to transcend it. And so, the story of Mercury ends not with a final transformation, but with a recognition. The pursuit of immortality was never just about escaping death. It was about affirming that life in all its transience is worth understanding, worth exploring, worth imagining into something more. Across the centuries, Mercury has shimmered in human imagination as few substances ever have. From the hidden chambers of medieval alchemists to the vast refineries of the industrial age, from royal laboratories to the sealed vessels of modern science, it has remained a fluid mirror, reflecting our deepest hopes and our gravest mistakes. The alchemists saw in Mercury not merely a metal, but the promise of transformation. To them, it was the bridge between decay and renewal, mortality and the dream of eternity. They devoted lifetimes to deciphering its mysteries, believing that within its restless gleam lay the secret of perfecting both matter and the human spirit. In time, their visions gave way to more precise knowledge. Chemistry replaced allegory, measurement supplanted metaphor, and the quest for transmutation yielded to the demands of industry and progress. Yet even as mercury became an ordinary commodity, an ingredient in thermometers, lamps, and electrical devices, it never entirely shed its ancient aura. Its story is a reminder that every scientific discovery is also a human story, a testament to our unquenchable curiosity, our capacity to dream beyond what we can prove, and our struggle to reconcile imagination with reality. Mercury's dual nature, useful and dangerous, beautiful and deadly, echoes the same tensions within ourselves. Today, as we learn to handle Mercury with care and respect, we also inherit the memory of those who first dared to believe that transformation was possible. Their ambition was never simply to master a metal, but to glimpse a larger truth, that life itself is an alchemy, forever seeking to change, to refine, and to reach beyond the limits of the known. In this way, the long, shimmering path of Mercury reminds us that even in the most familiar elements, there will always remain a trace of wonder, an invitation to look deeper, to question further, and to imagine more than the world has yet revealed. Thank you for joining this journey through time, legend, and science. May it inspire you to see with new eyes the hidden stories and the substances all around us, and to remember that every pursuit of knowledge begins with the same impulse, the desire to transform both the world and ourselves.